Hi, Spring fans. Welcome to another installment of Spring Tips. In today's installment, we're going to talk about a topic that I really wish we had been able to address in an earlier video, but for want of time and just for all this other interesting stuff, we never just really got around to it. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to finally visit this topic, namely configuration. And when I say configuration, what I mean is the textual values that we get from outside of our application or from outside of our Java code that inform the behavior of our Java code. So in order to do that, of course, we're going to go ahead and go to start.spring.io, build a new application. So configuration, I'll use Java 11. I'm going to bring in the reactive web support, which I don't actually need, but we'll talk about that in a bit. We're going to bring in Spring Cloud Vault. We're going to bring in the config server client. There we go. So we've got our different dependencies here. I think I'm satisfied with that. Let's hit generate UAO configuration.zip, and let's get to it. Okay. So here's our configuration class. And, I'm going to comment out some of the things that we don't need just yet. So, for example, the config and vault and all that stuff, goodbye. Don't need that. And I don't actually need WebFlex either. I just want the starter that is transitively brought in through all these Spring Boot and Spring Cloud dependencies, which is Spring Boot starter. But because I commented out the other two Spring Boot starters, nothing else would have brought it in for me. So that's why I explicitly brought it in that way. Let's make sure that we've done the Maven dance so that everything is synchronized. All right, now, this is just going to be a thing that gets run when the application starts up. Okay. Here we go. Runner. Okay. Return a new application runner, and there we go. This can be a Lambda, of course. Good stuff. Now, all we're going to do is we're going to inject the value here in. Well, actually, you know what? Before I get ahead of myself, we're going to use the environment. Okay, the environment is the most important abstraction in all of this, and yet you probably will never deal with it. The environment is the thing that sources or originates values from different places, different things, and makes them available to us as a uniform sort of dictionary of keys and values. That environment object in turn delegates to property sources, which are the actual things that adapt external, things in the world to strings that we can then read in our JVM. Okay. So one of these property sources knows about the special application.properties or application.yaml, okay, that Spring Boot has sort of standardized as a convention. So I can say that this is going to be a message from application properties, and I'll say hello from application.properties. Okay, there we go. So there's our three values, and I'm just going to read that value in. I'm going to say, I'm going to log it out, and in order to log it out, I should probably bring in Lombok, which is the compile time annotation processor. Good. And just use it to create a logger. I'm so lazy. I really should just create a field here. I don't need Lombok for that, but I might use it again later. You'll see. I might make two uses of it, in which case it pays for itself, especially since it burns away at compile time. It doesn't actually stick around in the class path at runtime, right? So there we go, Lombok. So logger dots info message from application dot properties environment dot get property quote quote. Okay, good. So there's our first one. Let's go ahead and run that and see what we get. All right, so we can see that it's reflected here in the output there. Hello from application.properties. Great. What you may not realize is that application.properties is arbitrary. You can actually name it anything you want, right? So one way to do that is to use a property called spring.config.name, okay? Now, of course, spring.config.name needs to be provided before you actually start reading in the application.properties. So one way to do that is to specify it as a program argument. Okay, so equals foo. Okay, spring.config equals foo, apply, and now let's see this application fail. Okay, I'm going to start it up and it'll fail. And the reason it's going to fail is because there's no foo.properties. Okay, there you go. It says null, right? So that's not going to work. So what I want here is to rename this to foo.properties. Foo.properties. Do refactor. Okay, there you go. It works again. So if you change that value, if you tell Spring to talk to a different config file, it can do that. You almost never need to do that, but people often ask, is that possible? And yes, it is. You can actually do that. More commonly, you're happy with application.properties, but you've got things that you want to be available only for certain profiles. Now in Spring, a profile is a string value that gets attached to both configuration properties and to objects. And it's a way of activating based on the activation of a particular profile, any given sets of configuration and objects that are attached to that profile, right? So I might have a Java object that I only want to run in production, for example. The profiles are for the most part, they're completely arbitrary. There's only two cases that are sort of magic that we care about, but the rest are completely arbitrary. You can name them whatever you want for whatever you want, right? You can have a profile for development and another one for Q&A and staging and production and whatever. You could have one that's like, only when running against Java 8 in this environment on Tuesdays or whatever. It's up to you to conditionally toggle on or off these various profiles. And because it's such a common use case and because it's so easy to do, you can actually say export Spring profiles active equals whatever. You could do a program argument just like I showed you. You could say spring.profiles.active equals foo or dev, right? You could do that. But if you're using IntelliJ or Spring Tool Suite, there's actually even just a thing here. You can just say dev. Okay, so now the default profile equals dev. And Spring Boot understands that you want certain configuration available only in the dev profile. So hello from dev application.properties. So the dev profile is active, which means that application.properties is active, but it'll be overridden by values in application-dev, right? So here we go. So it says hello from dev application. Okay. You could even ask, hey, what happens if I have a value in this case, it actually worked out. You got the more specific value. Okay, you got dev, you got the version of the configuration in dev. But what happens if there are no profiles active? That is to say, you want the lack of a profile is actually what's interesting, right? And that's very common in the git clone and run use case, right? I would love to be able to git clone an application and just do maven space spring-boot :run and see it working. And that's a very, very convenient experience for somebody. And you can do that with things like test containers now and in Docker. You can easily build a Java application that just runs. It gets the fully working thing runs by default. In this case, you'd use the default profile. Okay, so let's do a default profile. So I'll say, actually, I'll say this: Command V, default properties. Okay, hello from default. Okay, application of properties. So of course, in order for that to work, you need to remove the profile, right? I'm not using any profile. Okay, that's the point. And this too is also more specific than application.properties. So let's run. If there's any conflict, then application default wins, right? Okay, so there you go. Hello from application properties. Hello from default application properties. Okay, so that's also working. So this ability to tier configuration based on properties and profiles, very convenient, right? Another thing you may want to do, maybe you don't want to invent a whole new profile, but you do want to have like a fallback value for something, okay? And this is very useful, especially if you're doing @value-based injection, okay? So I can use @value. Be careful that you're not using lumbox @value. And here, I'm going to get the key, okay, like this. And I want to provide a default value that falls back. So this is very common if you want to reference a property. Maybe the property isn't defined, but if it is defined, you want it. So greetings from application, or greetings message. Okay, so if it's there, great. Default hello, okay? String default value. So here, log.info default value from application.properties. Default value. Good. So there's that. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm providing the key, and that'll work if it's present, but if it's not, I'll get the default one. Okay, so let's try that. Okay. Hello from application. I guess we can just use this again. Okay. So run. Okay. So I got the default value. I got hello from application of properties. Now let's go ahead and comment out this one, and that means that there's nothing defined. Nothing is providing that configuration value. Okay. So I get default hello instead. I get the default value instead of the one I wanted. That's a very convenient thing. And you can actually mix and match. Again, anything that you would have otherwise used to resolve a property can be used, inside of this default resolution. So again, lots of different places to get values. I might actually want to get this, right? I could say, let's use that, right? So okay, default hello from default application property. So I'm actually nesting. I'm saying if this is not available, kind of like a Elvis operator. If that's not available, then evaluate everything to the right of that, including the nested interpolation of other configuration properties. Okay, so very, very convenient. Where this becomes super convenient, I think, is in the use of environment variables, right? So you can actually do that in your property files as well. Let's say let's say that I want to have, let's say that we all know on Linux it's going to be users / home or whatever, right? So maybe that's your home directory. You're in a Linux or Unix environment. You typically each user has a home directory. Same for Windows, right? But let's assume that the application is designed to run in a production cluster that's using Linux, and it's always going to be under the same user. So the default common Linux home equals home bootable, whatever. Maybe that's the user. Okay, so that's the my custom home. Okay, and we can assume that's what we want by default, maybe. Okay, or better yet, actually, let's make sure it's actually if it's Linux, it's that. Great. Okay. That's an interesting example. Let's say that's not defined. Let's say I just want to inject that. Okay, so I can say, give me the home value. Okay, so I can use environment variables. This is another place where I can get the user home. Where I can get a property from is all the environment variables in my machine are now available to me as configuration values as well in the same syntax, right? So user home from the environment variable. User home. Run that. What do we get? Okay, so it gave me users JLong. So I could actually do some very smart things there, right? You can actually have very common kinds of configuration here. Another thing you might have done, maybe you want to configure maybe you need to configure a database. Okay, in the database, you know that your node is going to run on a machine that has an environment variable called db host, right? So you could say spring.datasource.username, URL equals JDBC Postgres user, DB host, right? DB name, right? You could do that kind of thing. So you can interpolate values inside of the configuration there. That also applies to the @value annotation in your Java code. Okay, very, very convenient. And you can also provide default fallbacks. You could say, okay, maybe it's DB host, otherwise default to localhost. Maybe it's DB name, but default to test, right? So you can actually have really, really complex expressions here by using this property placeholder resolution mechanism. Very, very convenient if you're trying to not have so many profiles. You don't want to have this Cambrian explosion of profile definitions out there. Okay, so I've got environment variables, I've got nested configuration, I've got default values, lots of different things you can do there. I've showed you so far a few different ways to get properties in from the outside of the application. One of them is to do program arguments. We saw that already. So let's see what that looks like. Let's suppose I wanted to override the application properties value there, okay? Or better yet, let's say I actually just inject a value from the program argument. So I'm going to say value message from program args, and if it's not available, I'll just return an empty string message from program args. Okay, and say log.info message from program args. Good. Okay, there's this. Now I'm going to run the application, and it should fail, but it's going to give us an empty string, right? Let's make sure of that. Okay, good. Now we go here, and let me just copy and paste this for ease of reproduction. Okay, go here. Program args -- equals hello from program arguments. Okay, use a quote. Good. Hit apply. Okay. Good. Okay, good. So you can see that works as well. You can also use environment variables, right? So let's say I have a custom message. Think about that data source example. In this case, I used external variables to build the data source, but maybe the whole thing is just completely up for grabs. It might be, it might just be easier just to say that I have an environment variable called spring underscore data source under URL underscore URL, right? So Command Shift U, turn it into an environment variable, and here I'll just pass it in. Okay, and here it'll be JDBC PostgreSQL localhost some DB. Okay, apply. So now in my configuration, I'm going to inject the environment. I'm going to inject the spring.datasource.url, which will be informed by the environment variable spring data source URL log.info spring.datasource.url. Good stuff. Look at that, huh? So I can now pull in these values. I can have a default configuration here, right? I can actually just leave that there, for example. And then if I provide an environment variable, that'll still win. That'll still override the inbuilt application.properties definition of spring.datasource.url. So that's what we want. We want the ability to have default values to fail, to degrade gracefully, to degrade to a known state whenever possible. Okay. So we looked at environment variables. We looked at program arguments. We've looked at sort of 12-factor style configuration. Again, if you've ever read the Heroku originated 12-factor manifesto, it stipulates that environment-specific configurations should live, guess where? In the environment, right? That's very useful because that way, if you move your binary from development to Q&A to staging, you can just override things in each environment by providing environment variables. That way you don't have to recompile the code. You get one true build, one build of truth, and promote that from one environment to another. This supports that. Spring Boot really makes that easy, right? You can just provide it environment variables, property files, all that kind of stuff. Maybe you want to have things in a configuration file, but you don't want it to live inside of your jar. That also is an option, right? So you can go here, okay, and Maven clean package, okay. This might fail. I don't know if I don't have any environment variables. I don't have any default values for a lot of these things. Oh, it worked. Yeah, I do have default value. See, I see it. See, I said colon blank, right? So that worked. Okay, so now target, and let's say echo spring.dataSource.url application.property. So I'm in the target directory, right? I have my jar, my actual jar, the application jar, and the property file. So now cat application.properties, Emacs application.properties. I'm going to launch Emacs from within a shell, from within IDE, my IDE. Hopefully the world doesn't explode. Yeah, we're okay. JDBC, Postgres, QL, localhost, or prod DB. Okay, so now I can say java -jar configuration. I'm in the same directory as application.properties, and there you can see spring.dataSource URL is equal to JDBC Postgres prod DB. So again, I don't even have to. In this case, I have a file that has as much configuration as I want, and it looks and works exactly like another application property. It could also be application.yaml, and yet I don't have to bake that into the jar. And that means if I have secrets and credentials that I don't want to share with the lowly developers for legal reasons and all that, great. I can externalize that, keep it in this property file outside of the application code itself. Very, very, very convenient mechanism. So all of that is using stuff that's built in with Spring Boot. But you can also provide your own property source. Suppose you had a JDBC database that has its own keys and values that you want to use in your configuration. You could create your own property source for that as well. So let's do that. So static class beautiful property source extends property source of type string. Okay, good. And we need a constructor, naturally. And the constructor, beautiful. Alrighty, so there's this. So my default property source, all it's going to do is when it's asked if name equals ignore case beautiful messages, okay, return hello from beautiful property source.class.get simple name. Okay, otherwise return null. Very, very simple, trivial example, but you can imagine that instead of hard coding strings, that you actually connect to a JDBC data store and do something of that sort. Now, we have to teach Spring about our new custom property source. The easiest way to do that is to actually plug it in before the application context gets initialized. So what's happening here is that Spring is creating something called an application context. That in turn creates the environment in which your application objects run. It also creates all of the configuration. It loads up all the configuration which gets plugged into your application context. So we need to teach Spring Boot about our custom property source, and it's best to do this as early as possible. If you can, you should do it here. But Spring application.run is kind of a convenience method. You don't want to use that for all your applications. So instead, you can use Spring Application Builder. You give it some sources, which is in this case the configuration application. Okay, and we're gonna call it run. Build, pass in args. So that should be roughly equivalent to what we had before. Indeed, that looks like it's equivalent as well. So let's go ahead and run that and see if that still works. If it works, great, then we're almost done. Okay, it works, so good. So we're on the right path. Then you can plug in an initializer. And this is where we actually teach Spring. We actually get to customize the application context before it's before it's been put into use. Okay, so initializers. Okay, just looking for a variadic array of initializers. There's the contract, and here I'm given a reference to the as yet uncreated application context. I can get a reference to it, and remember this is a special subclass of application context called configurable application context. I can get a reference to the environment. Normally the base class is just environment, but here it's a configurable environment. And then from there I can get access to the property sources, and then from there I can add a property source, right? So let's see what this gives me. Beautiful property sources. Okay, var property sources dot add first, add before. So I can give it the name of another property source and add it relative to the other one if I want to, or add last. Let's just do add last. And here, I'm going to add new beautiful property source. The name of the property source is beautiful, so I don't have to do anything special there. All right, lambda. And, I could probably just save myself some code here. Nice. Okay, much easier to work with that. Okay, so now let's run that. And if that works, then we should be able to use this key and value here. At value, string beautiful message thing. Okay, let's see. Message from custom property source. Beautiful message. Okay, there we go. So we can see it says hello, merge message from custom property source, hello from beautiful property source. So we've now taught Spring about a custom property source. This is as early as you can get it in there, really. Another way you can do it, if you want more configuration, if you want more flexibility, you might try this. I'm not guaranteeing that this is going to work all the time, but it works in this case. So contribute to property sources. I'm going to inject the configurable environment, and I'll initialize it there. I'll say configurable, I'll say environment dot get property sources dot add last new beautiful property source. So again, I commented out this bit here. This no longer is in play. I'm now doing it dynamically. I'm doing it at configuration time. So after the context has been started and things are starting to wire together, and that still works, right? But you might have some configuration that needs this value earlier on and things like that. So this is, your YMMV. Okay, there's no guarantee that that's going to work, but it works in this case, and it might work in your application as well. Okay, so either way, you've got now your own custom property source. Okay, you've got your own custom property source. What we can do is read in values from any number of different places, right? We've got values from -d arguments, from environment variables, from application.properties, from application.yaml, from program arguments. I mean, all sorts of different places. jopt, if you've ever used jopt, the command line argument framework, it's a separate. I think it's a separate project that's not maintained by Spring, but we support that as well. So all sorts of different places that you can use to originate your configuration. In Spring Cloud, we support Archaeus, right, which is another bridge for configuration from the Archaeus configuration management system. If you're using Kubernetes, you can use Spring Cloud Kubernetes. In just a bit, we're going to talk about two things: Spring Cloud Config Server and Spring Cloud Vault, both of which give you configuration. So lots of different places where you can draw your configuration from. But once you've got it, you can read it from the environment, or you can have it injected as a value into your beans, just as I've shown you here. All of that is fairly stringy, right? Lots of strings. And what I really want is to have all this stuff bound to an object, and then I can just dereference the properties in that object. And that's exactly what configuration properties do. So here, I'm going to create beautiful properties, and I'm going to create a field, private string message. Okay. So we're going to give this a root. This is a configuration properties root, CP. And I need Spring to know about my custom properties here. For now, we're going to use @data, @allargs constructor, no args constructor. So this is very Java beanie. Now let's make Spring aware of it. Enable configuration properties .class. All right, good. So we got our properties, and now I can log it out. I can actually log out the values. What is the value is going to be what? We're going to go to properties. We're going to say CP dot and configuration properties, CP equals configuration properties. So whatever, let's just make it beautiful. It's easier to see on the screen maybe. So beautiful dot message, is that right? So message equals hello from configuration properties. All right, good. So there's this, and I want to inject that. So here, we're not originating the value from some other place, but what we're doing with it is a little different, isn't it? We're actually binding it to this object. And again, this is how strings get turned into fields on objects, is the scope of a whole other video, and I will put that on the whiteboard, the proverbial whiteboard, the metaphorical whiteboard there, and we'll get to it some other video. But it's a huge topic in of itself, and we don't have the scope of the time for that here. So message from configuration properties, beautiful properties dot get message. Okay, restart. Good. So message from configuration properties, hello from configuration properties, huh? Not bad. So we've got that now as well. We've got a lot of different, we're able to get strings in and out of our Spring Boot application with very little fanfare, very quickly, very easy, very convenient. I'm using configuration properties here. This is Java Bean style, right? So I have getters and setters and all that kind of stuff. But what if you're using Kotlin? What if you're using Kotlin, which has data classes, or Scala with its case classes, which are, it's preferred that you construct those things with the constructor, right? So in this case, let's say I made this final, right? In which case I no longer need this. I just need a single constructor that takes the arguments as the parameters and then initializes the storage associated with those parameters in the class, right? So that's what required args constructor does. It creates a constructor, takes a single parameter, in this case name, in this case message, and then it says this.message equals message, right? So how do I tell the configuration properties mechanism to use that? Well, I can use constructor binding. Okay, this is a nice feature in Spring Boot 2.2, I think, right? So this is now a fairly new feature. That'll still work, is my point. So I can run that again. This is nice if you prefer your objects be more immutable and so on. There you go, very convenient. Okay, so far, everything we've done, very flexible. We haven't had to leave Spring Boot, and we've even gotten some ways to externalize our stuff into a separate configuration file, which can live outside of the application proper. But what if you want more fully featured support for those external files? What if I wanted to do version control? Or what if I wanted to do secure credentials, things like that? For this use case, there are other more suitable technologies. And I mentioned Spring Cloud's Kubernetes support for config maps, right? You can use that. I mentioned Spring Cloud Config Server and Spring Cloud Vault support. So let's talk about a couple of those, namely, first and foremost, the Spring Cloud Config Server. The Spring Cloud Config Server is actually a super popular project. It's one of our most popular projects because even if you're building a monolith or if you're building a microservice, it doesn't seem to matter. People want to externalize their configuration, and the config server is ready-made to do that. If you've ever seen me do the cloud native Java talk, then I used to do that talk a lot years ago, right? I haven't done that very often. I haven't done that very often recently, but in that talk, I would spin up a custom service registry, a custom config server, a custom history monitoring dashboard, a custom tracing tool. I mean, all with just a flick of a few annotations and the Spring initializer. So I love that we have this amazing thing called the config server. I love that it's pretty easy to configure it and to get it up and going. So I'm going to generate a new project. I'm going to call it config-server. I'll hit generate. Here we are, config server. Oops, server. Now, in order for this thing to do its work, we need to parameterize it. We need to customize it. We need to tell it to act as an API, to provide a HTTP API that will in turn talk to a Git repository. And that Git repository is github.com. Okay, and we're going to look at a repository that I've created recently. Greetings config repository. Now this configuration repository has one file that's 5 years old, so you can see I used to use that one a lot. And I've got another one here called beautiful.properties. So I want my HTTP API to talk to this version controlled Git repository. And the nice thing about that is I can actually since it's being managed out externally, my Spring Cloud config server can actually monitor that for changes. It can be notified of any changes in the Git repository and then update itself. And then my clients can, through the use of the refresh scope, in turn be updated, right? And that's a whole other thing. Maybe I'll do a separate Spring tip on just the refresh scope and the and all that kind of stuff. But for now, all you need to know is I have this Git repository. I want to use that, so I'm going to create a config server. So Spring Cloud config server Git URI, and the Git URI is what I got here. Okay, so paste that in there. I want this to run on port 8888, not 8080. Okay, and my Java code, I need an annotation to opt in to being a config server. So enable config server and go. Now my client side, I want to bring in the Spring Cloud starter config, Maven, re-import, and in order for this to work, I need to tell Spring Boot where to find the config server. So it's a chicken and egg problem. I can't use a property to tell it which property. I can't use a property to tell it where to find properties. I need to have that earlier on. So one way to do that is with the environment variables. Another, in Spring Cloud in particular, is something called bootstrap.properties. Okay, bootstrap.properties is great. It's a great place to put things like the config URI. So Spring Cloud config URI, HTTP, localhost 8888. Okay. Now that I've got my API up and running, I wanted to find the configuration values in this property file called Beautiful. So I'm going to give my microservice a name, Beautiful. Okay. Once that's done, I can then go to this. I can actually ask Spring to inject the message from the config server for me, just like any other configuration value. So, first of all, is Spring aware that I've reinstalled the config client? Let's make sure it is. Re-import. Okay, good. And now my code, I'm going to just inject that like any other variable. So value string config server. Okay, value from config server. So log.info message from the Spring Cloud config server, and good. Let's see if that works. I had trouble with this before. Sometimes Maven and IntelliJ get confused, so I might have to restart the IDE. Who knows? Hey, that worked. First try. Look at that. Love it. So message from the Spring Cloud config server is what I got here, right? I could go a little bit further. I could use the refresh scope. Like I said, that's one of the really interesting opportunities here. You can actually change the configuration in the Git repository and then publish an event in the application context that triggers a refresh of the configuration so that it would see, so that any bean that was annotated with @refresh scope, like so, on the receipt of such an event would then be recreated. So you'd actually get the new value from the config server. That's very, very useful for, if you have status notifications, or you want to disable certain things, or, whatever, feature flags, whatever you want to do. Lots of use cases there, but it's a little bit more than I want to get into in this video. Now, the config server, as I have it configured, is not secure. This is a wide open Git repository. It's public. You can get access to it. I'm not even signed in. So clearly wide open, not very secure. You're going to want to, at a minimum, lock down the communication from the Spring Cloud config client to the config server, and then lock down the communication from the config server to the Git repository. Okay, so there's 2 hops there. They can both be secured with username and password-based authentication or SSH, and so on. There's lots of different options there. You can and should use SSL, etc. Right? Lots of different options to keep this secure end-to-end as possible. If you want to, you can even do encrypted values in the Spring Cloud config server. So you can actually have a hashed, or not hashed up, but encrypted value in your property file that gets decrypted when you inject it into your Java process, but never before. Not over the wire, not resident in the files. So you have security at rest, right? You have credentials on the file system, but they're encrypted, and it's a one-way encryption, right? So Very, very convenient. Or it can be a two-way, right? Obviously, but very, very convenient to have that. That's a really, really a lot more configuration. That could also be a whole other video. If you're using Cloud Foundry, right? Particular the PAS runtime that VMware provides, the sort of fully souped up version of Cloud Foundry that we provide, that has a Spring Cloud config server instance that's fully secured and so on, just ready to use. But you can do that in the open source as well. Azure Spring Cloud has a config server you can use as well. So lots of different ways to get a more secure environment for configuration. Or you can just do it yourself. It's not hard. There's documentation. We put it out there, etc. I'm just not going to do it in this video. If you want security, however, you might already be using something called Hashicorp Vault. Now, Vault is a very convenient tool for secure credentials. Okay, it's a storage mechanism. It's a database for secure values, and the server itself is super secure and cryptographically secure, and beloved by security experts worldwide. Think of it like LastPass or 1Password, but for the enterprise, right? For enterprise applications. It can do things like password rotation, and it can integrate with all sorts of other things to do persistence and so on. But just a very, very useful database that's optimized for storing secrets. Okay, hence the name Vault. So we have a project called Spring Cloud Vault. You can easily add that into your application as well. So let's do that now here. And I'll go back to this build. I'll add Spring Cloud Vault to the class path. Okay, so now I've got that there now. Let's do Maven reimport. Okay, and in order for this to work, of course, you're going to need to specify, first of all, a few things about Vault. In particular, you're going to need to tell it where Spring Cloud can find Vault. Okay, so we need to specify a few properties. And this is also stuff that you put in either the environment variables or the bootstrap.properties, right? So one thing I'm going to put there is Spring Cloud.vault.token. And I'm going to have an environment variable called Vault token. Okay, so I'm going to dereference that. The other thing I'm going to do is Spring Cloud.config. I've already got that, don't I? I want the scheme, right? So I'm not doing the most secure version of Vault either. So it'll just be HTTP. All right, and that's it. That's the 2 bits I need there. Again, you should be using HTTPS. There's a lot of stuff that goes into setting up Vault in a secure way, but it can be done. That's the whole point. People, in production, you're definitely going to want to do that. A lot of different cloud providers provide secured, hardened versions of Vault out of the box, so you can just run those different implementations as well. But for my purposes, I've got it installed. I've got it running. I could just download it. It's just a Go binary. There's one binary. There's nothing else. It's just a little binary. So I just did brew install Vault, but you can just do whatever you want. Then you need to run it. Okay, so this is where we actually have to run it and configure it. So I've got some configuration here. I'll just copy and paste all that and paste that in a file. Okay, there we go. So it'll say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the application to start up on port 8200. I'm going to tell it to use a default token. Now, normally when you run Vault, it'll give you a token if you don't actually specify one. But here I'm just going to give it a token and start it up. So let's do that here in this node. Okay, so it's up and running. Now, on another shell, I'm going to configure it. And what I'm going to configure is I'm going to tell it, hey, Vault, I want to put a secret inside of the Vault under the bucket, if you will, called Beautiful. And I want the key to be named message from Vault server. And I want the value to be hello Spring Cloud Vault. Okay. So again, in order to interact with Vault, you need to have that Vault token. I need to also specify that when I connect my Spring Cloud application to Vault. So let's do this here. Good, there you go. So I've written one value to Vault. It's ready to use now for my Java code, and we need to specify that environment variable. Okay, so Vault token equals that. So now, environment variables, Vault token. Good. So there we go, Vault token. apply, hit OK. Now we want to change our code to use that value from the Vault server. So Vault server, value from Vault server. It's from Spring Cloud Vault server. Goody. Alrighty, let's see if that works, huh? So give it a go. To make sure that Maven appreciates what's just happened here, that we've reincorporated Vault. Okay, and go. Okie doke, there we go. There's the value from the Spring Cloud Vault server. Now that's encrypted, that's super secure. You know, it's the Fort Knox of passwords. And obviously you could use that to store your Spring underscore data source underscore URL, or you could just say spring.datasource.url equals, and then source the value from Vault. And notice that all the other stuff still works as well. So the config server works, the local property files, all that other stuff that we looked at still works. So you can plug in, you can mix and match these things. They can play well together, and they can reference properties from each other. All that works out of the box. One common question is, well, why couldn't I just run Spring Cloud config server and have it use the Git-backed storage repository for 90% of my configuration, and then use Vault for my secrets, that kind of thing? And you can do that. That's actually a possibility. You can actually have a backend that uses Vault as well. Lots of different opportunities there. I find that this is just fine. And from the perspective of my code, nothing changes. Who cares whether it talks to a config server and then makes another hop to Vault, or if it just goes straight to Vault? From the perspective of my code, it doesn't matter whether this is specified as an environment variable, as a property, as a -d argument, or a program argument, or whatever. It just works. And that's, at the end of the day, really what I want. So now we've looked at a number of ways to make our applications more flexible, more robust. We looked at some other things like binding. We just touched on that very, very briefly on configuration properties and binding. We ever so briefly touched on things like profiles, right? These are, again, these two things could in of their own in of themselves require a whole other video. Ditto for Spring Cloud Config Server, ditto for Spring Cloud Vault. But what I hope you can appreciate is that if you understand the basics of the machinery, then it all just sort of works, right? I don't have to, you can see that I don't even have any imports in my code here for any of these other types, right? Here we go, right? It's just Spring Framework and Spring Boot. There's no even, do I even have Spring Cloud? I don't even have any generic, I don't have any Spring Cloud types here at all. So it just works, right? I don't know that I'm dealing with Spring Cloud types. I hope you learned something from this, my friends. I hope you got something out of it. As always, thank you so much for watching.